He stalks, he manipulates, and he kills. Yet, we can't stop rooting for him. Joe Goldberg is the charming yet deadly protagonist of the show You, and somehow he has garnered our sympathy despite his horrifying actions. But why? Why do we continue to excuse a character when we know that if we ever came face to face with them, we would fear them and be scared for our lives? That's what we're talking about today. We are doing a deep dive into why we continue to root for a romantic psychopath. But before we dive in too far, I should introduce myself. Hi, my name's Erin. I'm a licensed therapist and I love analyzing all things pop culture. And as I said, today we're doing a deep dive into Joe Goldberg, specifically why we continue to root for him. We're going to talk through the anti-hero effect, the power perspective, moral relativism, and a few other things as well. Joe Goldberg is part of a long line of morally gray characters that we love. From Walter White to Dexter, we can't seem to get enough of characters who really challenge our moral compass. But why is that? Why would we want to root for somebody that internally makes us challenge our values? Psychologists actually call this the anti-hero effect. It's the idea that when a story is told from the narrative of a morally ambiguous character or a villain, we begin to empathize with them. We see their shortcomings, their reasonings, their vulnerabilities, and before you know it, we start to excuse their very morally questionable actions. This is furthered because Joe is presented as a character who is looking for love. We really get a backstory from him. He's running from his past, and the more you watch the show, the more you start to recognize he has a very traumatic past. And so it introduces this information that makes us want to justify his actions even further. Another major reason that we end up rooting for Joe is because we are inside the mind of Joe. The entire show is told from his perspective, so we begin to identify with him. We are not just watching Joe, we are Joe. And there's aspects of him that are really likable. He's funny, he's smart, he's charismatic. So you begin to fall into this narration because you begin to empathize with his mind because you are identifying with him. Like I said, we're not just watching Joe, we are Joe, and we are seeing the world through his distorted lens. This psychological technique is known as narration bias. We are given access to a character's inner thoughts, and because of that, we begin to understand their inner motivations, even if they are completely irrational. Joe Goldberg convinces us firsthand that he has to do what he has to do, when in reality, he's always had a choice. But because we're getting firsthand perspective and motivations from him, we buy into that narrative. I mean, think about it. If you were just objectively watching him stalk these girls and be incredibly creepy, you'd be like, ugh, this guy is so gross. But you're given so much more information to weigh in the midst of assessing his decision making. So it convinces us to empathize with him and actually start to see his point of view, despite it being incredibly wrong and incredibly irrational. One of the sneakiest tricks that You plays on us is making us question if Joe's victims are actually really that innocent. For example, Beck in the first season is seen as self-absorbed and unfaithful, or if we move to the second season, Love is seen as just as violent as Joe, which in reality, she probably would have been a good match for Joe, if we're being honest. But it's really interesting as you watch that season as he rationalizes his own behavior but can't rationalize hers. Incredibly hypocritical. And even Candace, who had a very self-righteous justice about her, was even painted as an antagonist at one point in the show. The show muddies the waters of morality, making us really question if Joe is the worst person in the room. And that's part of the brilliance of the show. There's actually a term for this. It's called moral relativism. It's where there's characters that are also flawed surround a villain, and so you start to justify the actions of your villain based on the flaws of the other characters. So you start to think as an audience, well, Beck wasn't that great of a girlfriend, so I kind of get it. Or, well, Love was really crazy, so I get what he had to do there. When in reality, it just makes us feel less guilty rooting for an individual whose actions were completely inexcusable. And Joe sees himself as somebody that is reacting to the behavior of others rather than actually instigating harm. There is complete lack of ownership. He is always saying things like, "You made me do this," or "I had no choice." He always had a choice, but the brilliance in doing this is it gets the audience to subtly believe the same thing. We again end up justifying his actions, even though they're inexcusable, and rooting for an anti-hero that is doing some pretty creepy and weird and illegal things. And let's be honest, Joe Goldberg is charismatic. He is smart, he's well-read, articulate, he can be surprisingly kind when he's not killing people. And these are traits that we typically associate with quote-unquote good people. So it further confuses our moral compass. I've talked about this effect before, but it's definitely present in this show. I talked about it in my Blake Lively video, but this is called the halo effect. This is where, because somebody portrays a few good characteristics, they get confused as morally being a good person. Joe treats Paco with kindness. He even saves Ellie. He speaks with such beauty about literature and romance. And so there's this part of us that wants to believe there's good in him, especially because as we learn his backstory, we learn that he was extremely traumatized as a child. So even that kind of begins to justify some of his actions now, like, oh, he's just so broken. But the truth is, even the worst people can be charming. Even the most traumatized people can still be morally bad. But Joe uses this charm, this charisma, as a complete weapon. He creates such a likable character, not just for the characters around him, but for the audience as well, making it even more difficult to condemn him and his actions. Joe's self-awareness really makes us think there might be some goodness in there, that he really does want to change. He constantly talks about wanting to get better and to heal. He moves away from places so that he's not drawn into his compulsions. And this convinces us that he has goodness in him and that he's just a broken person trying to find some redemption, when in reality, his compulsions always win out at the end of the day. This creates what's called redemption arc illusion, which is where a character is given multiple opportunities over a series of time to change, but they never do. But we want to believe that Joe can be redeemed. But if history tells us anything, he's probably not going to be redeemed, despite his effort to do so. But that's what makes him so terrifying as a character, is his continual manipulation of the audience, of characters around him, of his continual convincing that he is making movement towards being a good person, especially because he does good actions in the midst of all of his negative, terrible, horrifying actions. Psychologically speaking, true change requires accountability, and that is something that Joe has not wanted to do in any of the seasons, like I was saying earlier. At the start of every season, he's given the fresh opportunity to change, and every season ends in the same way, in his cycle of obsession and violence. The question is not, can Joe be redeemed, but does he actually want to be? So why can't we stop rooting for Joe Goldberg? Well, he's a masterfully crafted anti-hero. We see the world through his eyes, and he confuses our moral compass at every turn. But here's the truth. Joe Goldberg is not a misunderstood romantic. He is a psychopath. If we ever saw him in real life, we would not be rooting for him. We would be running from him. So what do you think? Where do you think season 5 is going to take us? I think it's the last season. I'm curious to see how it'll end. I have my own theories. I'd love to hear yours in the comment. Are you a person that you fell under Joe's spell, or have you always seen him as the true psychopath he is? Let me know in the comments. I love doing this. It is so much fun for me, and I can't wait to keep growing my channel. Any support is so appreciated, whether that be a like, a comment, a subscribe, whatever it is, I'm super grateful. And I can't wait to keep growing my channel. I will see you all soon.